the spring of 1943, in a small confessional booth in occupied Belgium, a Catholic priest named Henri Reynders sat in absolute darkness, listening to a confession that would change everything he thought he knew about his sacred vow of silence. On the other side of the wooden partition, an SS officer was unburdening his soul, detailing with chilling precision the locations of upcoming raids against Jewish families hiding in the countryside, the names of collaborators who had betrayed their neighbors, and the exact routes the Gestapo would take through the forests surrounding Liège. The officer's voice trembled as he described the children he had helped load into cattle cars, seeking absolution for sins that haunted his nights. Father Reynders listened in silence, his hands pressed together in prayer, but behind his calm exterior, a war was raging in his mind. The seal of confession was absolute, inviolable, sacred beyond question. To break it meant excommunication, eternal damnation, the destruction of everything he had devoted his life to protect. But as the officer's whispered confessions painted a map of death and suffering in the priest's mind, Henri Reynders made a decision that would place him at the center of one of World War II's most morally complex acts of resistance, a decision that the Church still refuses to officially acknowledge today. Before the Wehrmacht rolled through Belgium in May of 1940, Henri Reynders was exactly what you would expect from a Catholic priest in a small European town. Born in Brussels in 1899, he had entered seminary at 17, been ordained at 24, and spent nearly 2 decades serving his parish with unremarkable devotion. His days followed the ancient rhythms of the Church: morning mass, afternoon visits to the sick, evening vespers, and the confessional booth every Wednesday and Saturday. The people of his parish knew him as a gentleman with a scholar's face and a tendency to lose himself in theological texts, someone who seemed more comfortable with Latin manuscripts than with the messy realities of human suffering. Belgium itself existed in that strange European twilight between the wars, a small nation that had already been crushed once by German boots in 1914 and now watched with growing dread as Hitler's shadow stretched across the continent. When the invasion came, it took just 18 days for Belgium to fall, and suddenly Father Reynders found himself living in a world where the rules he had spent his entire life following seemed dangerously inadequate for the moral catastrophe unfolding around him. The occupation transformed Belgium into a suffocating prison of collaboration and resistance, where every conversation could be a trap and every friendly face might be reporting to the Gestapo. The Germans established their administrative control with brutal efficiency, and by 1942, the persecution of Belgian Jews had escalated from discrimination to systematic deportation. In cities like Brussels and Antwerp, yellow stars appeared on coats, businesses were shuttered, and families began disappearing in the night. The countryside around Liège, where Father Reynders served, became a hiding place for hundreds of Jewish families fleeing the urban roundups, farmers and villagers, risking their lives to shelter strangers in barns, cellars, and forest cabins. But the SS and their Belgian collaborators were hunting these refugees with methodical determination, and the resistance networks that tried to protect them were fragmented, desperate, and operating blind. They had no way of knowing where the next raid would strike, which hiding places had been compromised, or which neighbors had been turned into informants. People were making decisions in the dark, and they were dying because of it. Father Reynders understood the mechanics of confession in a way that few outside the priesthood could comprehend. The confessional was designed to be a space outside of normal human judgment, a direct channel between the sinner and God, where a priest served merely as a witness and conduit for divine forgiveness. When someone confessed their sins, the priest was bound by the seal of confession, the sacramental seal, which prohibited him from revealing anything he heard under penalty of automatic excommunication. This wasn't just a strong suggestion or a matter of professional ethics. This was absolute church law, codified in canon law, reinforced by centuries of tradition, and considered so inviolable that priests throughout history had chosen torture and death rather than break it. The logic was simple but profound. If people could not trust the absolute confidentiality of confession, they would not confess their sins, and without confession, there could be no absolution, no reconciliation with God. The entire sacramental system depended on this wall of silence, but the architects of that system had never imagined a confessor sitting in darkness while an SS officer detailed tomorrow's murder plan. The confessions began sometime in the winter of 1942, though the exact date has been lost to history because Father Reynders never wrote down what happened in that booth. The SS maintained a significant presence in the Liège region because of its strategic importance, and several officers attended Mass at Father Reynders' church, perhaps seeking a veneer of respectability or spiritual comfort in the midst of their duties. Canon law required that priests be available to hear confessions from anyone who sought them, and so when these men knelt in the confessional, Father Reynders had no choice but to listen. What he heard there would have broken most men. The officers confessed to participating in executions, to turning over hiding places of Jewish families, to the rape of women in occupied territories, to acts of cruelty so specific and detailed that the priest could visualize the faces of the victims. Some sought genuine absolution, their voices choked with self-loathing. Others seemed to be using the confessional as a kind of psychological dumping ground, unburdening themselves so they could continue their work with a lighter conscience. And in their confessions, they revealed operational details, names, dates, and locations that could save lives if only someone could act on them. For weeks, perhaps months, Father Reynders remained paralyzed by the impossible choice before him. Every fiber of his training, every instinct formed by decades of devotion, screamed at him to remain silent. He prayed constantly for guidance, searching the scriptures and church teachings for some precedent, some exception that might resolve the moral paradox consuming him. But there was none. The Church's position was crystal clear. The seal of confession was absolute, regardless of what was confessed, regardless of what future harm might be prevented by breaking it. A priest who heard a confession that someone planned to commit murder could not warn the intended victim. A priest who learned the location of a bomb could not alert the authorities. The confessional existed outside the normal moral universe, in a space where only God's judgment mattered. But as Father Reynders sat alone in his rectory at night, listening to the distant sounds of trucks carrying people to deportation, he began to question whether God had ever intended for his law to become an accomplice to genocide. And then, one Wednesday evening in early 1943, he made his choice. The mechanism Father Reynders devised was simple in its execution, but devastating in its moral complexity. After hearing confessions that contained actionable intelligence about SS operations, he would leave the church through a side entrance and walk to a small cafe 3 blocks away, where members of the local resistance regularly gathered under the guise of playing cards and drinking beer. He never entered the cafe himself. Instead, he would pass by the front window at a specific time, and if he paused to adjust his hat or light his pipe, it was a signal that he had information to share. A resistance member would then follow him at a distance to a pre-arranged meeting point, usually the cemetery behind the Church of St. Martin, where conversations between a priest and a parishioner seeking spiritual counsel would raise no suspicion. There, in whispered exchanges among the gravestones, Father Reynders would relay what he had heard in the confessional, carefully framing it not as direct quotations, but as vague warnings or hunches. He never said, "An SS officer confessed this to me." He would say things like, "I have reason to believe the Gestapo knows about the family hiding near the old mill," or "It might be wise to move the children from the Dubois farm before Saturday." This thin veil of deniability was how he preserved what remained of his conscience, a psychological fiction that allowed him to believe he was not technically breaking the seal of confession, even though he absolutely was. The impact was immediate and undeniable. Resistance networks that had been operating in near-total darkness suddenly had a source of intelligence that seemed almost supernatural in its accuracy. Families scheduled for arrest were evacuated hours before the SS arrived at empty safe houses. Ambushes planned against resistance supply routes were abandoned when the partisans mysteriously changed their routes at the last minute. Collaborators who had infiltrated resistance cells found themselves quietly isolated and neutralized before they could do damage. The Germans began to suspect they had a leak somewhere in their command structure, but they never imagined the source was a mild-mannered priest who heard their confessions every Wednesday and Saturday. For nearly 18 months, from spring 1943 through the autumn of 1944, Father Reynders operated this impossible double life. By day he performed Mass, visited the sick, and maintained the routines of parish life with such normalcy that even his fellow priests noticed nothing unusual. By night, he carried the crushing weight of his violation, praying for hours in the empty church, begging God for forgiveness even as he prepared to sin again the following week. The human cost of his decision extended far beyond the lives he saved. Father Reynders understood with absolute clarity that he had placed his immortal soul in jeopardy for the sake of temporal lives, and the Catholic theology he had devoted his life to studying offered him no comfort on this point. If the Church's teaching was correct, if the seal of confession truly was inviolable under any circumstance, then he was committing a mortal sin each time he passed information to the resistance. He had weighed eternal damnation against the lives of Jewish families, partisan fighters, and innocent children, and he had chosen the children. This was not a decision born from theological sophistication or careful casuistry. It was a raw, desperate choice, made by a man who could no longer bear to be a passive vessel for information that could prevent suffering. He never discussed his actions with other priests or sought guidance from his bishop, because he knew what they would tell him. The Church's position was absolute, and any priest who learned what he was doing would be obligated to demand he stop immediately or face excommunication. The resistance members who received his intelligence had no idea of the spiritual crisis consuming their source. To them, Father Reynders was a hero, a brave ally who risked his life to fight the occupation. They did not understand that his risk was infinitely greater than theirs, because while they feared death or torture, he feared something far worse. They could not comprehend the architecture of guilt he had constructed around himself, the careful mental compartmentalization required to kneel before the altar each morning and consecrate the Eucharist while knowing he was in a state of mortal sin. Some of the resistance fighters were themselves Catholic and would occasionally joke about how fortunate they were to have a priest on their side, blessed by God. Father Reynders would smile thinly at these comments and say nothing, because how could he explain that he believed himself to be cursed, not blessed, condemned by the very institution he served? By the summer of 1944, the nature of the confessions began to change in ways that terrified Father Reynders, even more than the original moral transgression. As the Allied invasion gained momentum and the German position in Belgium became increasingly desperate, some SS officers began confessing not past crimes, but future plans, seeking absolution in advance for atrocities they knew they would be ordered to commit. They spoke of scorched earth policies, of orders to execute hostages, of plans to destroy entire villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters. These were not confessions of sins committed, but blueprints for massacres yet to occur, and Father Reynders realized he was receiving advance warning of war crimes that would kill hundreds if he remained silent. The moral calculus shifted yet again. It was one thing to break the seal to reveal past crimes or current operations. It was another entirely to possess foreknowledge of planned mass murder and do nothing. In those moments, kneeling in the darkness of the confessional booth, listening to a German officer mechanically describe the liquidation of a village scheduled for the following Tuesday, Father Reynders felt the last remnants of his theological certainty crumble away. The system Father Reynders had established worked with lethal precision through the spring and summer of 1944, but it began to fray under the weight of its own success. The Gestapo's frustration grew with each failed raid and each mysteriously abandoned safe house, and their investigations intensified throughout the Liège region. They began monitoring churches more carefully, photographing parishioners, tracking the movements of priests, and interrogating anyone who seemed to have advanced knowledge of their operations. The SS officers who confessed to Father Reynders remained oblivious to the connection between their whispered admissions and the resistance's uncanny foreknowledge, but the German intelligence apparatus was methodically eliminating possibilities. They executed suspected informants within their own ranks, tortured captured resistance members for information about their sources, and placed the entire region under increasingly suffocating surveillance. Father Reynders, knew it was only a matter of time before the net tightened around him. But he could not stop. Each confession brought new information too valuable to waste, new lives hanging in the balance, new choices between silence and action. The psychological toll became visible to those who knew him well. Father Reynders had always been a thin man, but by mid-1944 he had become gaunt, his cassock hanging loose on a frame, hollowed out by stress and sleeplessness. His sermons, once delivered with scholarly precision, became increasingly abstract and tortured, filled with references to Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, to Peter's denial of Christ, to Judas's betrayal and suicide. Parishioners who had known him for years began to worry about his health, suggesting he take time to rest or visit family in Brussels. He refused all such suggestions with a terseness that was unlike him, because rest was impossible when every Wednesday and Saturday brought new confessions that demanded new betrayals. He developed a tremor in his hands that made it difficult to hold the chalice during communion, and more than once he had to excuse himself during Mass to vomit in the sacristy, his body physically rejecting the contradiction between what he professed at the altar and what he practiced in the cemetery. The resistance network that benefited from his intelligence grew bolder and more effective with each successful operation. They began to trust the information so completely that they planned increasingly ambitious actions based on it, ambushing German supply convoys, rescuing prisoners from transport trucks, even attempting to assassinate a particularly brutal Gestapo commander whose confession had revealed his daily routine. This last operation failed when the commander changed his schedule at the last minute, and 3 resistance fighters were killed in the botched attempt. When Father Reynders learned of their deaths, he spent an entire night on his knees before the altar, trying to understand the mathematics of his guilt. Had he saved those 3 men by providing the intelligence that kept them alive until that moment, or had he killed them by giving them false confidence in the infallibility of his information? The question had no answer, but it joined the growing collection of unanswerable questions that haunted him. The relationship between Father Reynders and the resistance members became increasingly strained as the war progressed. They wanted more from him, more details, more specific intelligence, more frequent meetings. They began to pressure him to not just relay what he heard, but to actively probe during confessions, to ask leading questions that might extract additional useful information. This he absolutely refused to do, because it crossed a line even his compromised conscience could not accept. A priest could listen to a confession, even if he later violated the seal by repeating what he heard, but to manipulate the confession itself, to turn the sacrament into an interrogation, was a desecration so profound that he could not contemplate it. His refusal angered some resistance members who saw his scruples as a dangerous luxury in wartime, and bitter arguments took place in the cemetery, whispered fights where Father Reynders had to defend the sanctity of a sacrament he was already violating every time he met with them. The breaking point came in August of 1944, just weeks before Belgium's liberation. An SS officer confessed to Father Reynders that he had been ordered to execute 32 hostages in retaliation for a resistance attack on a German garrison. The execution was scheduled for the following morning at dawn in the town square. The officer's confession was different from the others, his voice thick with genuine horror at what he was about to do, begging for absolution while simultaneously explaining that refusal to follow the order would result in his own execution for cowardice. He gave every detail: the location, the time, the names of 12 of the hostages he had personally reviewed on the execution list, the number of soldiers in the firing squad, even the fact that the hostages included a 14-year-old boy whose only crime was being the son of a suspected resistance member. Father Reynders listened to this confession in a state of absolute paralysis, knowing that if he maintained the seal of confession, 32 people would die at dawn, and if he broke it, he would be directly responsible for whatever chaos his interference created. He granted the officer absolution with words that felt like ashes in his mouth, and the moment the German left the confessional, Father Reynders made his decision. Father Reynders did not go to the café that night. Instead, he went directly to a farmhouse 5 kilometers outside town, where the resistance maintained one of its command posts in a hidden cellar beneath the barn. He had never visited this location before, had always insisted on maintaining the careful protocols of dead drops and cemetery meetings, but 32 lives in less than 12 hours left no room for caution. He arrived just after midnight, his bicycle rattling over the dark country roads, and when he knocked on the farmhouse door, the resistance fighters inside barely recognized the wild-eyed priest who pushed past them and demanded to speak with their commander immediately. In the cellar, surrounded by maps and weapons and young men who smelled of gunpowder and fear, Father Reynders laid out everything he knew about the planned execution with a precision that shocked everyone present. He gave them the exact location in the town square, the time of 5:30 in the morning, the number of soldiers in the firing squad, the route the hostages would be transported along from the Gestapo holding cells. He told them about the 14-year-old boy and about the SS officer's genuine reluctance, details that served no tactical purpose, but that he seemed compelled to share, as if speaking them aloud might somehow distribute the weight of what he knew. The resistance commander, a former schoolteacher named Marcel Dumont, who had lost his entire family in a deportation, listened to Father Reynders with growing alarm. What the priest was proposing, though he had not stated it explicitly, was a daylight raid on a heavily guarded execution in the center of town with less than 6 hours to plan and prepare. It was borderline suicidal. The Gestapo would have the square surrounded, snipers on the rooftops, machine gun positions at every intersection. A rescue attempt would almost certainly result in more deaths than it prevented, and it would bring savage reprisals down on the entire town. Dumont said all of this to the priest, expecting him to back down, to acknowledge the impossibility of what he was asking. But Father Reynders did not back down. Instead, he explained with terrible clarity that if they did nothing, 32 people would die, and that he could not live with that knowledge, could not grant absolution to a man who would murder a child at dawn and then simply wait for morning to arrive. He had already damned himself by breaking the seal of confession, he told them. He would not compound that damnation by allowing the information to go unused. If they would not attempt a rescue, he would go to the town square himself and physically place his body between the hostages and the firing squad. The resistance fighters in that cellar had to make an impossible calculation in the early hours of the morning. They had perhaps 60 effective fighters in the entire Liège region, and committing them to a daylight operation against prepared German positions could destroy their network entirely. But they also understood that Father Reynders was serious about his threat to intervene alone, and if a Catholic priest was publicly executed for attempting to shield hostages, the reprisals would be catastrophic anyway. More than that, several of the men in the room recognized names on the list of hostages the priest had provided. One was a cousin, another was a former colleague, a third was a neighbor who had hidden resistance fighters in his attic for 6 months. The decision was not really about tactical wisdom or probability of success. It was about whether they could live with themselves if they did nothing. They decided to act, and in the 4 hours remaining before dawn, they assembled the most desperate plan in the history of their resistance cell. The plan was built on speed, chaos, and the exploitation of a single narrow window of vulnerability. Father Reynders had mentioned that the hostages would be transported from the Gestapo cells to the town square in 2 trucks, traveling along Rue de la Cathédrale, a narrow street with tall buildings on both sides. The execution was scheduled for 5:30, which meant the trucks would likely depart the Gestapo headquarters at approximately 5:15 to allow time for the hostages to be positioned in the square. The resistance would hit the convoy on Rue de la Cathédrale at exactly 5:20, using the buildings for cover and the narrowness of the street to prevent the German escort vehicles from maneuvering. They would have perhaps 90 seconds to kill or suppress the guards, extract the hostages from the trucks, and disappear into the maze of side streets before German reinforcements arrived. 90 seconds to save 32 lives, or die trying. They divided their forces into 3 teams, one to attack the convoy directly, one to provide covering fire from the rooftops, and one to guide the freed hostages through a pre-planned escape route to safe houses in the countryside. Father Reynders demanded to be part of the escape team, and though the resistance fighters tried to refuse him, he would not be deterred. At 5 in the morning, as the first grey light touched the rooftops of Liège, Father Reynders knelt in his church one final time. He did not pray for success or for the safety of the resistance fighters, or even for the lives of the hostages. Instead, he prayed for the soul of the SS officer who had confessed to him, the man who would arrive at the town square at 5:30 to find his victims vanished and his conscience unexpectedly unburdened of one atrocity. Father Reynders prayed that God would forgive that officer for the murders he did not commit and for the relief he would surely feel at their prevention. Then the priest stood, removed his clerical collar for the first time in 20 years, and walked out into the dawn to commit the most holy sin of his life. The convoy left the Gestapo headquarters at exactly 5:17, 2 minutes later than the resistance had anticipated, which meant the attack would happen deeper into Rue de la Cathédrale than planned, closer to the town square where German reinforcements could respond faster. Father Reynders waited in a doorway halfway down the street, pressed against the cold stone, watching the resistance fighters on the rooftops signal to each other with hand gestures he did not understand. He could hear the trucks approaching, the growl of engines echoing off the narrow buildings, and beneath that sound something worse, voices singing. The hostages in the back of the trucks were singing hymns, their voices carrying through the pre-dawn air, and Father Reynders recognized the melody as one he had taught in his church, a song about lambs being led to green pastures. The irony was so cruel it made him physically ill, but there was no time for reflection, because the first truck was entering the kill zone and the world exploded into violence so sudden and total that his mind could barely process what was happening. The resistance fighters opened fire from 4 different positions simultaneously, their guns creating a deafening cacophony that shattered windows and sent pigeons erupting from the rooftops in panicked clouds. The German driver of the first truck was killed instantly, his vehicle lurching to a halt and blocking the narrow street. The escort car behind it tried to reverse, but was caught by gunfire from the rear position, its windshield disintegrating into sparkling fragments. German soldiers poured from the vehicles, shouting orders and returning fire, but they were caught in a crossfire with no cover, and within 30 seconds half of them were down. Father Reynders watched from his doorway as a young resistance fighter named Thomas, barely 18 years old, sprinted from a side alley to the first truck and began tearing at the canvas covering the bed where the hostages were imprisoned. German bullets chewed up the cobblestones around Thomas's feet, but he did not stop, did not even flinch, and then the canvas was open, and people were spilling out, confused and terrified, and Father Reynders was running toward them, forgetting every instruction he had been given about staying in position. The hostages were in shock, many of them beaten and bloody from their interrogations, stumbling into the street with their hands still bound behind their backs. Father Reynders reached them and began pushing them toward the escape route, screaming at them to run, to move, to trust him. But several were frozen in place, unable to comprehend that they were being rescued rather than executed in a different location. The woman fell to her knees either from relief or exhaustion, and the priest had to physically lift her and carry her toward the alley where other resistance fighters were frantically waving them forward. Behind him, the gunfight continued with savage intensity. He saw Marcel Dumont, the resistance commander, standing in the middle of the street with a rifle, firing methodically at German soldiers who were trying to set up a machine gun position. He saw Thomas take a bullet in the shoulder and keep running anyway, dragging 2 hostages toward safety. He saw a German officer emerge from the second truck and immediately recognize what was happening, his face transforming from confusion to rage as he realized his prisoners were escaping. The 90-second window the resistance had calculated was already gone, stretched to 2 minutes, then 3, and still not all the hostages had been extracted. Father Reynders could hear sirens in the distance, reinforcements arriving from the German garrison on the edge of town, and he knew they had perhaps 60 seconds before this rescue became a massacre. He ran back to the second truck, where 5 hostages remained trapped inside, too injured or traumatized to move on their own. A resistance fighter was trying to pull them out one at a time, but it was too slow, and Father Reynders made a decision that surprised even himself. He climbed into the truck bed, positioned himself behind the hostages, and simply pushed them out, letting them fall onto the street where other hands could grab them and drag them to safety. It was brutal and graceless, and at least one man screamed as his broken leg hit the cobblestones, but it worked. The last hostage tumbled from the truck just as the German reinforcements rounded the corner 3 blocks away, and then everyone was running, resistance fighters and rescued hostages alike, disappearing into the maze of alleys that the Germans did not know as well as the Belgians who had been born there. Father Reynders ran with them, his lungs burning and his vision narrowing to a tunnel, following the person in front of him through a blur of doorways and courtyards and narrow passages between buildings. Behind them, the Germans were firing blindly into the alleys, their bullets sparking off stone walls and shattering roof tiles. Someone next to the priest grunted and fell, and hands reached down to grab the wounded fighter and keep moving. They emerged into a small square where a horse-drawn cart waited, already loaded with empty vegetable crates to hide the hostages, and people were being shoved underneath the false bottom while the driver whipped the horse into motion before everyone was even concealed. Father Reynders ended up in a cellar he did not recognize, surrounded by people he had helped rescue, all of them breathing hard and staring at each other with the wild eyes of people who could not quite believe they were still alive. In the distance they could hear the Germans tearing the neighborhood apart, searching house by house, but the resistance had planned the escape routes too well. By the time the sun fully rose over Liège, all 32 hostages had vanished into the network of safe houses, and the Germans were left with nothing but empty trucks and 8 dead soldiers in a street littered with spent ammunition. The German reprisal was immediate and merciless, but it was also unfocused in a way that revealed their complete bewilderment at what had happened. The Gestapo could not understand how the resistance had known about the execution with such precision, how they had assembled a force large enough to overwhelm a protected convoy, and most importantly, how they had coordinated an escape that seemed to anticipate every German response. Within hours of the ambush, every church in Liège was surrounded by soldiers demanding to inspect parish records and question priests about their recent activities. The Germans had a theory, poorly formed but not entirely wrong, that someone with access to their internal communications had betrayed the execution plan. They arrested 17 people that day, mostly random suspects pulled from their homes, based on nothing more than proximity to Rue de la Cathédrale or previous associations with known resistance members. 3 were executed in the town square at noon as a warning, shot in the exact spot where the 32 hostages would have died if Father Reynders had maintained his sacred vow of silence. The priest watched this new execution from the window of a safe house, and though he felt the weight of those 3 deaths on his soul, he did not regret his choice because the mathematics were irrefutable. 3 dead instead of 32 was still a victory, even if it was a victory that tasted like poison. Father Reynders could not return to his church. The moment the Germans began their sweep of the clergy, the resistance had insisted he go into hiding, and he now found himself living in a succession of cramped attics and damp cellars, moving every 2 or 3 days to stay ahead of the Gestapo's investigations. His absence from the parish was explained by his bishop as a sudden illness requiring extended rest, but this excuse would not hold for long. The Germans were methodical in their suspicions, and they had already begun to notice patterns. Parishes where Father Reynders had served seemed to have lower rates of successful Gestapo operations. Resistance activities in his area showed unusual foreknowledge of German movements, and several arrested resistance members under torture had mentioned a priest who provided intelligence without ever naming him directly. The net was tightening, but the Allied advance was tightening faster. By late August 1944, American forces were pushing through France, British tanks were racing across Belgium, and the German occupation was collapsing into chaotic retreat. The question was whether Father Reynders could remain hidden long enough for liberation to arrive, or whether the Gestapo would find him first and make an example of a priest who had betrayed the confessional. Living in hiding transformed Father Reynders in ways that went beyond the physical deprivations of cold rooms and meager food. For the first time in his adult life, he could not perform the daily rituals that had structured his existence. No morning mass, no afternoon prayers in the church, no evening vespers, no confessions to hear. The rhythm of priesthood that had sustained him for 2 decades was gone, and in its absence, he was forced to confront the full magnitude of what he had done without the comforting routines of ecclesiastical life to distract him. He spent hours each day in prayer, but his prayers had changed. He no longer asked God for forgiveness, because he had concluded that what he had done was unforgivable within the framework of church law. Instead, he prayed for understanding, asking God to help him comprehend whether he had acted in accordance with some higher law that superseded the sacramental seal, or whether he had simply chosen his own moral judgment over divine commandment. The distinction mattered to him enormously, even though the practical result was identical. The resistance members who rotated through the safe houses to check on him treated him with a reverence that made him deeply uncomfortable. To them, he was a hero who had sacrificed everything to save lives, a saint who had placed human compassion above religious dogma. They brought him extra food when they could spare it, refused to let him help with dangerous tasks, and spoke about him in whispers as if he were somehow sacred. Father Reynders understood that they did not grasp the theological implications of his actions, that they saw the breaking of the confessional seal as a brave act of defiance rather than a potential damnation. He tried to explain it to Marcel Dumont one evening, tried to make him understand the difference between civil disobedience and sacrilege, but Dumont simply looked at him with tired eyes and said that any God who would condemn a man for saving 32 lives was not a God worth worshipping. The comment haunted Father Reynders because part of him agreed with it, and that agreement felt like the final proof of his apostasy. In early September 1944, a Gestapo raid on a safe house 2 blocks from where Father Reynders was hiding resulted in the capture of 4 resistance members, and under interrogation, one of them broke. He did not give up the priest's current location because he did not know it, but he confirmed that a Catholic priest had been providing intelligence to the resistance for over a year, and he described the general area where the priest was believed to be hiding. The Gestapo immediately ordered every building in a 12-block radius searched, and the resistance was forced to move Father Reynders in broad daylight, disguised as a wounded factory worker being transported to a hospital. They put him in the back of a truck covered with a tarp, surrounded by actual wounded resistance fighters, whose groans and bloodied bandages would discourage close German inspection. As the truck rattled through a checkpoint, Father Reynders lay perfectly still beneath the canvas, listening to German soldiers walking around the vehicle, hearing their boots on the cobblestones just inches from his head, and he found himself thinking about the SS officer who had confessed the execution plan, wondering if that man was among the soldiers now searching for him, wondering if their roles would reverse and he would someday find him. Elf confessing his sins to a man whose sins he had once betrayed. The final confession came on September 9th, 1944, just 5 days before American forces would liberate Liège, though Father Reynders had no way of knowing liberation was that close. He had been moved to a farmhouse 15 kilometers outside the city, far enough from the German dragnet to provide some safety, but isolated enough that he felt completely cut off from the events unfolding around him. The resistance had largely ceased using him as an intelligence source because he could no longer access the confessional, and his value had shifted from operational asset to symbolic figurehead, a living reminder of what they were fighting for. But the SS officer who had been confessing to him for nearly 18 months did not know the priest had disappeared, and when he arrived at the church for his regular Saturday confession, he found the confessional booth empty and a young replacement priest who knew nothing about the arrangement. The officer left the church in visible distress, and one of the resistance members who maintained surveillance on the parish followed him through the streets of Liège as he walked aimlessly for hours, clearly struggling with some internal crisis. The resistance member reported this behavior to Marcel Dumont, who made a decision that would haunt everyone involved. He decided to bring the SS officer to Father Reynders for one final confession. The operation to extract the German officer without killing him required a level of precision the resistance had rarely attempted. They waited until he was walking alone through a poorly lit street near the river, then surrounded him with 6 armed fighters who gave him a choice: come quietly or die immediately. The officer, perhaps recognizing that death might be preferable to what was coming, chose to surrender. They blindfolded him, bound his hands, and transported him in the trunk of a stolen car to the farmhouse where Father Reynders was hiding. When they pulled him from the trunk and removed the blindfold in the barn, the officer found himself face to face with the priest who had heard his confessions for a year and a half, and the recognition that dawned in his eyes was terrible to witness. He understood instantly what had happened, understood that every confession he had made had been transformed into a weapon against his own forces, and the betrayal shattered something fundamental in him. He did not rage or threaten. He simply stood there trembling, staring at Father Reynders with an expression of such profound hurt that several of the resistance fighters had to look away. Father Reynders asked to be alone with the officer, and after a tense debate, the resistance agreed but positioned armed guards just outside the barn door. The two men sat facing each other on wooden crates in the dim light filtering through the barn slats, and for several minutes neither spoke. Finally, the SS officer asked in heavily accented French why the priest had done it, why he had violated the most sacred trust in the Catholic faith. Father Reynders could have offered justifications or explanations about the greater good and the mathematics of lives saved, but he sensed that this moment required something closer to the truth. He told the officer that he had broken the seal of confession because he was weak, because he could not bear the weight of knowledge without action, because he had chosen the temporal world over the eternal one, and would likely spend eternity paying for that choice. He did not ask for the officer's understanding or forgiveness. He simply acknowledged what he had done and accepted full responsibility for it. The confession, because that is what it had become, lasted nearly an hour, and by the end both men were weeping. The SS officer then did something that no one expected. He asked Father Reynders to hear his confession one final time. The priest initially refused, explaining that he had forfeited his right to serve as a confessor through his betrayals, but the officer insisted with a desperation that suggested this was not really about absolution, but about completing some psychological circle that had been broken. Father Reynders eventually agreed, and there in the barn, without the structure of the confessional booth, without the comforting anonymity of the wooden partition, the SS officer confessed everything. He spoke for over 2 hours, detailing not just the crimes Father Reynders already knew about, but years of atrocities stretching back to the earliest days of the war. Villages burned in Poland, mass executions in Ukraine, the casual cruelties of occupation duty that had slowly eroded his humanity until he could participate in genocide without feeling anything at all. He confessed that he had initially sought out Father Reynders' confessional because he recognized the priest as someone who still believed in absolute moral categories, and he needed to hear himself condemned by that absolute standard in order to feel anything at all. He confessed that part of him had suspected the priest was breaking the seal because the resistance operations had become too precise, but he had continued confessing anyway because the alternative was to have no one to confess to at all. When the confession ended, Father Reynders granted absolution using the traditional Latin formula, his voice steady despite the surreal horror of the situation. The SS officer crossed himself, thanked the priest with formal courtesy, and then asked the resistance members to execute him immediately because he could not return to his unit and could not live with what he had done. Marcel Dumont refused this request, explaining that the officer would be held until liberation and then turned over to Allied authorities for trial. But the officer repeated his request with increasing urgency, explaining that he had information about a final German operation planned for the following day that would kill hundreds if it succeeded, and he would trade that information for a quick death. The resistance fighters looked to Father Reynders for guidance, and the priest found himself facing one final impossible choice: allow the officer to die by execution to obtain intelligence that could save lives, or insist on preserving his life and lose the information that could prevent a massacre. The mathematics of his entire moral framework had led to this moment, and there was no way forward that did not require him to value some lives over others. Father Reynders made the decision that would define the remainder of his life. He told the resistance to accept the officer's bargain. The German revealed that the retreating SS units planned to blow up the main bridge over the Meuse River at precisely noon the following day, not as a military operation, but as a final act of spite designed to kill as many Belgian civilians as possible. The bridge was the primary route for refugees fleeing the combat zone, and intelligence suggested that over 300 people would be crossing it at noon when the explosives detonated. The officer provided exact details about the placement of the charges, the timing mechanism, and the location of the detonator team that would trigger the explosion from a safe distance. He gave this information calmly and methodically, as if he were filing a military report, and when he finished he stood and asked the resistance to honor their part of the agreement. Marcel Dumont looked to Father Reynders one final time, searching for some indication that the priest would object, but Father Reynders said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and nodded once, and 2 resistance fighters escorted the SS officer outside. The single gunshot that echoed across the farmyard 10 minutes later was the sound of Father Reynders' last illusion dying, the final acknowledgement that he had moved so far beyond the boundaries of his priesthood that there was no path back. The resistance moved immediately to neutralize the bridge demolition, sending their most experienced fighters to locate and disable the explosive charges before noon the following day. They found the bombs exactly where the SS officer had described them, sophisticated demolition charges wired to a central detonator and hidden beneath the bridge's support structure. Disarming them required skills the resistance barely possessed, and they worked through the night with hands that shook from exhaustion and fear, cutting wires and removing detonators while German patrols passed overhead on the bridge itself. By dawn they had disabled 4 of the 5 main charges, but the 5th was placed in a location so precarious that any attempt to reach it risked causing the very explosion they were trying to prevent. The resistance made the decision to evacuate the bridge area and post guards to prevent civilian access until they could develop a better plan. But the German detonator team arrived early, at 11 in the morning instead of noon, and when they triggered their device, the single remaining charge detonated with enough force to collapse a 20-meter section of the bridge into the river below. 3 people died in the explosion, 2 resistance fighters who were still working on the evacuation, and 1 civilian who had ignored the warnings and attempted to cross anyway. The death toll would have been catastrophic if the resistance had not disabled the other charges, but that fact provided no comfort to Father Reynders when he learned that his intelligence, purchased with a man's execution, had still resulted in deaths. He tried to perform the mental arithmetic that had sustained him through 18 months of betrayals, the calculation that 3 deaths were better than 300, but the numbers no longer made sense to him. He had become a collaborator in an execution to prevent an explosion that had partially happened anyway, and the moral architecture he had constructed to justify his actions collapsed under the weight of this final failure. He spent the days following the bridge explosion in a state of near catatonic silence, speaking to no one, eating nothing, simply sitting in the corner of the farmhouse bedroom, staring at a wall while the sounds of distant artillery grew closer as the Allied forces approached. Liberation came on September 14, 1944, when American tanks rolled into Liège and the German occupation evaporated in a matter of hours. The city erupted in celebration. Resistance fighters emerged from hiding to embrace the liberators, and church bells that had been silent for 4 years rang out across the city. Father Reynders heard the bells from the farmhouse and understood that he should feel joy or relief or gratitude, but he felt nothing except a profound exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Marcel Dumont arrived at the farmhouse that evening in an American jeep, grinning and triumphant, and told the priest that he was a hero, that the resistance wanted to present him to the Allied command as one of their most valuable intelligence assets, that there would be medals and recognition, and perhaps even papal acknowledgement of his courage. Father Reynders listened to this with the expression of a man receiving a death sentence, and when Dumont finished, the priest asked only one question: could he return to his church now that the Germans were gone? Dumont assured him that he could, that he was free to resume his life, and Father Reynders thanked him quietly and asked to be left alone. That night, Father Reynders wrote a letter to his bishop confessing everything he had done during the occupation. He detailed every instance of breaking the sacramental seal, every piece of intelligence he had passed to the resistance, every operation he had enabled through his betrayals, and the final execution he had authorized by accepting the SS officer's bargain. The letter was 23 pages long, written in meticulous handwriting that showed no erasures or corrections, as if he had been composing it in his mind for months and was simply transcribing a completed text. He ended the letter by requesting formal laicization, the process by which a priest is released from his vows and returned to the lay state, explaining that he could no longer in good conscience claim to be a servant of God when he had so thoroughly violated the laws of the church he served. He sealed the letter, addressed it to the diocesan office in Brussels, and placed it on the table in the farmhouse bedroom. Then he lay down on the bed, still wearing the civilian clothes he had worn in hiding, and waited for morning to come so he could face whatever judgment awaited him. The response from Father Reynders' bishop arrived 3 weeks later, and it was nothing like what the priest expected. The bishop did not acknowledge the confession in writing, did not address the specific violations detailed in the 23-page letter, and did not grant or deny the request for laicization. Instead, the response was a single paragraph ordering Father Reynders to return to his parish immediately, resume his duties without public comment on his wartime activities, and report to the diocesan office in Brussels at a date to be determined later. The tone was bureaucratic and cold, devoid of either condemnation or support, and Father Reynders understood immediately what was happening. The Church was choosing to ignore his confession because acknowledging it would require them to address the impossible theological questions it raised. If they officially recognized that he had broken the sacramental seal, they would have to excommunicate him. But excommunicating a priest who had saved hundreds of lives during the Nazi occupation would be a public relations catastrophe in liberated Belgium. So instead, they were choosing institutional amnesia, pretending the confession had never been written, and hoping the entire matter would fade away if everyone simply refused to discuss it. Father Reynders returned to his parish in early October 1944 to find his church decorated with flowers and filled with parishioners who had heard rumors of his heroism during the occupation. They applauded when he entered for the first Mass, and several people approached him afterward with tears in their eyes, thanking him for his courage and his sacrifice. The resistance had apparently spread stories about a mysterious priest who had helped save countless lives, and though they had been careful not to reveal the specific mechanisms of his assistance, the general outline was widely known. A man of God who had risked everything to fight evil. Father Reynders accepted their gratitude with a numb politeness that masked his internal horror, because these people were praising him for the very actions that had severed his connection to the divine. He resumed his duties mechanically, performing Mass and hearing confessions and visiting the sick, but it was like watching someone else's hands move through familiar rituals. When parishioners came to the confessional booth, he granted them absolution with the proper words, but internally he questioned whether those words meant anything at all, coming from a priest who had proven the seal of confession was not absolute. The psychological fragmentation accelerated over the following months. Father Reynders began experiencing what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress, though in 1944 there was no framework to understand or treat it. He had nightmares about the SS officer he had sent to execution, dreams where the man's face appeared in the confessional booth asking for absolution that never came. He developed a compulsion to count things, repeatedly tallying the lives saved against the lives lost, 32 hostages minus 3 reprisal victims, minus 3 bridge casualties minus 1 executed German officer, running the numbers over and over as if some combination would finally produce an answer that made sense. His sermons became increasingly abstract and disturbed, filled with references to Judas and Peter and the difference between betrayal and denial, until his fellow priests began to express concern about his mental state. The diocesan office sent a representative to evaluate him, and Father Reynders sat through an interview where he was asked careful questions about his experiences during the occupation, while being implicitly warned not to provide answers that would require official action. The breaking point came on a Saturday in March 1945, 6 months after liberation, when a middle-aged woman entered Father Reynders' confessional booth and began to confess that she had been having an affair with a married man. It was a mundane sin, the kind of confession he had heard thousands of times before the war. But as the woman spoke, Father Reynders found himself paralyzed by a simple question. If this woman confessed that she planned to murder her husband, would he maintain the seal of confession this time? Or would he alert the authorities as he had done with the SS intelligence? He realized he no longer knew the answer, realized that he had destroyed his OAB, an ability to function as a confessor, because he could no longer trust himself to follow the rules he was supposed to uphold. He sat frozen in the darkness of the confessional, unable to respond, while the woman's voice trailed off into confused silence. Finally, he whispered through the partition that she should find another priest, that he could not help her, and then he stood and walked out of the church in the middle of confession hours, leaving a line of bewildered parishioners staring after him as he disappeared into the street. Father Reynders never returned to that confessional booth. He wrote a second letter to his bishop, this one much shorter, stating simply that he was psychologically unable to continue his duties and needed to be removed from active ministry. The diocese, perhaps relieved to finally have an excuse that did not require them to address the theological implications of his wartime actions, granted his request within days. He was transferred to a monastery in the countryside, a place of silence and contemplation where he could live out his days without the responsibilities of parish work. The official story presented to his former parishioners was that Father Reynders had suffered a breakdown from the stresses of occupation and needed extended rest, which was true enough in its way. The resistance fighters who had worked with him were disappointed but not surprised when he disappeared from public life, and a few of them visited him at the monastery in the early years, bringing news of the outside world and thanking him again for his service. He received them politely but discouraged repeat visits, and eventually they stopped coming, understanding that the man they had known during the war no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Father Henri Reynders lived for 32 more years after the war ended, dying quietly in the monastery in 1977 at the age of 78. He never spoke publicly about his actions during the occupation, never wrote a memoir or gave an interview, and actively discouraged any attempt to document his story for historical records. The monastery became his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could exist in a state of permanent penance without having to confront the world that wanted to celebrate him as a hero. He spent his final decades in manual labor and private prayer, working in the monastery gardens and attending services with a regularity that suggested either profound devotion or profound ritual, though those who knew him suspected it was the latter. In his final years, when other elderly monks would gather to share stories of their lives before taking vows, Father Reynders remained silent, and the younger monks learned not to ask about the faded scars on his conscience that were as visible as if they had been carved into his flesh. He died as he had lived those final 3 decades, alone with his choices, unable to resolve the contradiction between the lives he saved and the vows he shattered, a man trapped in the gap between human morality and divine law. The historical record of Father Reynders' activities during World War II remains deliberately incomplete, obscured by the Church's institutional reluctance to examine the theological implications of his case. The resistance networks he assisted were well documented by post-war historians, and the operations he enabled saved an estimated 400 to 600 lives through various interventions, though the exact number is impossible to verify. The rescued hostages from the Rue de la Cathédrale ambush survived to tell their stories, and several of them tried to locate the priest who had orchestrated their rescue, but the Church consistently denied any knowledge of his specific involvement. The SS officer who confessed to Father Reynders and was later executed by the resistance was never identified by name in any official record, his death attributed to resistance action without elaboration. The bridge demolition that partially succeeded, despite the priest's intelligence, claimed those 3 lives and remains a footnote in the liberation of Liège, overshadowed by the larger celebration of freedom. The church archives in Brussels contain Father Reynders' 23-page confession, but it has never been made public, and likely never will be, locked away as evidence of a question the institution cannot answer. What makes Father Reynders' story so haunting is not the heroism of his actions but the impossibility of his choice. He existed at the intersection of 2 absolute moral systems that demanded contradictory responses. The Catholic doctrine that declared the seal of confession inviolable under any circumstance, and the basic human imperative that possessing knowledge of preventable suffering creates an obligation to prevent it. Modern ethicists and theologians still debate his case in academic circles, though rarely with his real name attached, arguing about whether extreme circumstances can justify violating sacred vows, whether individual conscience can supersede institutional law, whether the mathematics of lives saved can ever outweigh the breaking of an absolute promise. But these debates miss the essential truth of Father Reynders' experience. He did not make his choice because he had resolved the theological contradiction. He made it because the alternative was unendurable, and he spent the rest of his life paying the psychological price for choosing human compassion over divine obedience. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more painful. A good man forced to become bad by circumstances that should never have existed. The legacy of Father Henri Reynders exists in the hundreds of people who lived because of his betrayals, in the families that exist today because their grandparents were not executed in a town square or blown apart on a bridge. Most of them never knew his name or understood the specific mechanism of their salvation, but they lived, and they had children, and those children had children, and the ripples of his choice extend through generations. But his legacy also exists in the unresolved questions he left behind, in the theological wound he opened that the Church has never properly addressed. What happens when following God's law requires complicity in evil, when maintaining sacred vows means becoming an accessory to murder, when the choice is between damnation through action or damnation through inaction? The Church wants to forget Father Reynders because his story exposes the brutal truth that moral systems designed for normal times collapse under the weight of extreme circumstances, and that sometimes the only way to remain human is to break the rules that define your humanity. This is the story the history books barely mention and the Church refuses to acknowledge. A priest who weaponized the confessional, turning the most sacred space in Catholicism into an intelligence-gathering operation, and who saved hundreds of lives by becoming precisely the kind of priest his vows forbade him to be. Father Henri Reynders understood that he was committing a mortal sin every time he passed German secrets to the resistance, understood that he was risking eternal damnation for the sake of temporal lives, and he did it anyway because the alternative was to let children die while he protected his own soul. In the end, perhaps that was the most profound act of faith imaginable, believing in God deeply enough to risk God's judgment, trusting that a divine being capable of creating moral law would also be capable of understanding why a human being might need to break it. Or perhaps it was the ultimate act of doubt, the choice of a man who no longer believed that any God worth worshipping would build a moral system that required complicity in genocide. Father Reynders took that question to his grave, and 80 years later we still do not know the answer.